Geraldo Cadava, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Other than Rubio and Cruz, what other Latino population or persons do you see evolving or developing a national who may be a candidate in the future, vice president or president?
There's a woman in New Hampshire who's a congressional representative named, I believe, I'm glad that this part's not televised because I'm probably going to get her name wrong, but I think it's Marilinda Chavez, who's a representative of the state of New Hampshire. She's been identified as a rising star of the Republican Party. I think Jeb's, is it son or grandson? The little brown one. It's George H.W. Bush's grandson, who he called him the little brown one. It's not.
I was gonna say, be sure to explain
in quotation
that.
Marks.
Thank you.
Yeah, in 1990, he talked about how he was very proud of his grandchildren. You know, the little brown one. And oh man, what's his name? George P. Bush or something? I think he's like the land commissioner of Texas now, which is seen as a kind of stepping stone for the governorship. And he's was awarded a Latino Leadership Award by the University of Texas a couple of years ago, and he's kind of seen as up and coming within state politics in Texas, and as we know, Texas can be a proving ground for future national politicians. So I would say George P. Bush and Marilinda Chavez are the two I would.
What on the Democratic side?
I still think Joaquin Castro, the Castro brothers, Julian Castro and Joaquin Castro, I think they have a following, and if they get more responsibility and exposure nationally, could be successful. I think we'll see what happens with the new chair of the DNC, Tom Perez. He's certainly energetic and could have a following from that position. So those are a couple. But there are lots out there. I mean, I will say that I think it's kind of widely perceived that the Republican Party has done a better job of developing its bench than the Democrats have with not only Latinos, but any kind of younger leaders. I think a lot of people were, Republicans loved to make this point during the primary campaign season that if you just look at the primaries, the Republican Party seemed much more youthful than Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders.
What do you see as the future for the wall and between the U.S. and Mexico? And if indeed it is not possible, what would the fallout be from the from voting population? I guess maybe Hispanic, but also Trump's voters.
Mm-hmm. Well, he seems pretty committed to building the wall. It seems more than just campaign bluster. But what do I think about its future? I kind of think that the same thing will happen with it that have happened with border walls around the world, but in the United States in particular, where they become architectural artifacts and relics of particular political moments that don't necessarily serve the function or aren't successful at performing the job they were intended to perform. So the border now, the literal border, if you go down, and it's a hodgepodge of wiring, vehicle barriers, steel walls. It becomes the object of graffiti by artists. It becomes something to tunnel under. It hasn't been an effective deterrent to its purported purpose. It costs billions of dollars to construct. So if his wall gets built, I expect that it will become much the same thing, a kind of canvas for artists, something for people to go under, go across. You can find images on Google of human catapults and all kinds of things. And people will tell you that the purpose of the border wall is more deterrence. It's more to kind of be a big imposing barrier that will cause people to think twice. But I wouldn't expect it to fundamentally change the way that border communities in the United States and Mexico relate to one another. I think it will be, from the perspective of border communities, a big, ugly imposition amid them. I would be surprised. As Doug mentioned about my 2013 piece, and as I mentioned with the pieces about Jeb and Marco Rubio, I've been wrong before. I'm sure I'll be wrong again. But I don't see all 2,000 miles getting built. That seems kind of unimaginable to me for lots of reasons. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of the challenges he's running up against from local property owners who are having to give their property up, and these are many of them even Trump supporters. They're not happy about having to move in order to build the wall. And I think that the Army Corps or whoever, the private contractors, whoever ends up building it, I think they're going to find some really unfriendly territory. I mean, physically unfriendly territory in the Arizona desert and elsewhere. It's very hard to. That's been a challenge in the past. How it will affect the politics, I guess the way I hear that question, do you mean like, I take you to mean like, are Trump supporters going to say in 2020, like, you promised a wall, you broke your word because the wall is not built? Maybe there will be some of that, but I would guess that he will pin the blame on other people, that he tried, it didn't work. I also think that even if people are upset, they're not going to change their fundamental position on immigration or the border, so they will continue to support him, I would guess.
I was also reading something the other day about Rio Grande Valley, referred to earlier, but that very large part of the border that is the Rio Grande River. But there's a treaty that between the United States and Mexico that says that neither side can obstruct the river in any way. And so the only place that'd be quite an engineering feat to build, because the border is the center of the river in many places. And so even engineering-wise, to put a wall there would be problematic. And violate that treaty. And so the only place to put the wall is to come. Mexico's not going to give up its side of the river, so it means coming onto the American side, and then almost certainly only by eminent domain. But so you end up with a very conservative government that's generally finds eminent domain very problematic, taking all this property along the Rio Grande Valley, or in the Rio Grande Valley, which is some of the most productive farmland in that neck of the woods, and then put up a wall that then cuts off the remaining land from its most important natural resource, that being the Rio Grande River. So it's very complicated.
And of course, the reason that it's an issue of eminent domain and why American property owners are upset is because the wall has to be built in the United States. It can't be built on the border, or certainly not in Mexico, because why is Mexico going to go along with that? And they're certainly not going to pay for it. They don't. I just don't see why they would. It doesn't make sense. So. What's that?
Maybe we can pay Mexico to let us build a wall.
By their side of the river.
Maybe that'll happen, and then he'll claim victory or something like that. I mean, the border, like so many issues, it's like, this is probably true of lots of presidents. I'm a historian. I make history my business. It's my job, so I know these things, but I don't expect that every incoming president knows them. But the border and its construction is one among many examples where it sounds much easier as a campaign trail promise, and presidents are confronted with the reality on the ground of particular communities and their history that make it much more challenging. I think we see that on a whole range of issues. I don't know if this president, compared with others, has some unique unawareness of history, and I don't know the room. So I don't know, but I don't know.
This is not a political question, but among all the families in these Hispanic families in all the various parts of the United States, if a Guatemalan woman wanted to marry a Cuban or a Mexican, will the family say, no way? Yeah. Or is there a lot of intermingling among them?
There is. I would expect it to be somewhat analogous to other communities, but one of my colleagues at Northwestern named Frances Aparicio, she's the director of the Latino Studies program at Northwestern. She actually just finished a book about intra-Latino families and Puerto Ricans who marry Mexicans, etc. Maybe the differences between Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans becomes a kind of barb between them, like, I have citizenship because I'm Puerto Rican, I was born a citizen, so many of your people are undocumented. These are like it's like jokes that Kansans tell about Coloradans and Coloradans tell about Kansans or something. There would be things like that maybe in their relationship, but I don't think there's certainly no equivalent of like anti-miscegenation or anything like that. I think it probably is more a circumstance of where you live and who's around where you live and who you come into contact with. I mean, in many places like Texas, certain areas of Texas that are like 97% Mexican, you're more likely to marry a Mexican probably. So it probably has to do with the community and who you're more likely to come into contact with. But there's no kind of hard and fast line that Cubans can't marry Puerto Ricans or Puerto Ricans can't marry Mexicans.
But isn't it the case that in the United States, if it was 60 years ago, and we're in New York City, and working class family, working class Italian girl wants to marry working class Greek boy, there are a lot of families that would have had a problem with that. Would have said, you can't do that. You're getting outside the family. My sense is that that those, not black-white scale, but that a sharper, that there still are overtones of partly that are just the result of that the differences between ethnicities, those kinds of tensions fade out of contact. And so, for instance, these Mexican populations that are now in the U.S., it's out of their contact with Guatemalans in the U.S. that then a subset begins to get over those things.
Right.
But my sense is that culturally those things still do linger.
Culturally, yes. I was just thinking, in my experience, having had Jewish girlfriends, for example, issues of religious conversion and stuff like that, those kinds of impediments to marrying across ethnic, religious, racial lines, I don't think, I've never studied this. I will go have this conversation with Frances. It's just my sense that there aren't those kinds of impediments. What you would see are just the kind of, like you said, like cultural or family impediments, maybe families of certain class backgrounds or status. So a long time, maybe the man I write about in my book, Alex Jacome, a department store owner in Tucson, Arizona, a long-standing Republican and member of the community, a fairly affluent member of the community, a fairly light-skinned member of the community. Would he have a problem with his sons marrying an undocumented Central American who crossed the border in the 1970s? Perhaps. But that's more about like social class and class status than I think any kind of religious or legal impediment, That's just my sense.
Christine, let's go over to Charlie over here. Hang on one second, Charlie. Let the microphone get there. But let me tell you real fast. When I was a kid, the same branch of the family I was talking about before, there was a very big deal made once about one of my cousins marrying a woman from deep in Texas. But the big deal was that she was Catholic, and we were fundamentalist Christians. We were hardcore primitive Baptists. And so there was a lot of concern about that. When I look back on it in hindsight, I think she was also Latino, but nobody noticed that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Go ahead, Charlie.
One of the things I'd like to hear from you is a little discussion about opiates and what's happening in regard to South America and this country as far as opiates are concerned, and what do you think should be done?
Oh boy. Solve the hemisphere's drug problems in a minute. Let's see. Opiates in particular? Are you thinking like cocaine as well? Or
heavy stuff more than anything else, yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe just the issue of how drug trafficking is such an issue of the border debate.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
It plays out in so many different ways. I think that in the debates about immigration, it plays an outsized role compared to its, numbers of immigrants crossing, those kinds of things. I mean, I think you just have to take Donald Trump's speech in Phoenix, Arizona in August of this past year, where he very performatively brought onto the stage 10 family members or something whose children had been killed by undocumented immigrants, and it was all about criminals and drug cartels. That's an old practice in Arizona in particular. You'll remember that Arizona's governor, Jan Brewer, talked about the impetus for SB 1070 being, finding heads of bodies rolling in the Arizona desert that had been left there by the violent cartels. So I think it plays...
Which was not true.
Oh, which was
Right.
not true. Sorry, she later apologized for that. And certainly, it was quickly debunked. So in the immigration debate, it plays a large role rhetorically. And as Doug mentioned, even in his introductory comments, there's actually no statistical evidence to back up. In fact, it's quite to the contrary, the idea that immigrants are, undocumented immigrants are criminals and more prone to commit crimes here in the United States. They want to stay here. They don't want to commit crimes. They're not criminals because they don't want to get deported. They try to evade the officers because they don't want to get deported. So it's quite the contrary. Does play an outside role. I mean, in terms of actual policy, I mean, I do think that it's at least as much a problem of consumption as production. It's as much a problem of demand as it is supply. And, that's not a deeply studied position. That's just what I believe. And I do think that it would be a good first step for, that's like an issue that Americans can't acknowledge. I don't mean you in this room. I mean, like, part of our public debate about drugs is not our own dependency and our own demand for them. It's only the drug cartels that are pushing them on us and are criminalized. I think that has its analog in the undocumented immigration debate too, where our own complicity in perpetuating that system and wanting $8 t-shirts or 75-cent apples or whatever, our own complicity, even when we go to the store to buy goods produced by undocumented immigrants, is not acknowledged. So I guess I would want just a simple acknowledgement of our own role in things, our own complicity in it. That's something I would want. Does that kind of get at some things that you're wondering about, or what else do you want to know about? I can see in your face that, like...
No, I think you've begun to answer.
Begun, yeah. That's probably all I can do, to be honest.
Comprehensive immigration reform,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to a path to legalization and then subsequently a path toward citizenship, what should be the next highest priority in any immigration reform?
That's a good question. It's a really good question. Those have been for the past, since Congress really started responding to the increase in undocumented immigrants in the late 60s, early 70s, through like the Peter Rodino bill in the early 70s, Carter's Alien Adjustment and Naturalization Act or Citizenship Adjustment Act. Since the beginning of those kinds of debates, those have been like the two main pillars, in addition to the increased hiring of more border patrol, etc. Those things haven't worked and they haven't worked, and the fact that those are still the three main pillars of immigration policy suggests like a lack of creativity in thinking about the issue too, that the same things keep getting proposed. But to answer your question more directly, I think some sort of realistic determination of the number of visas that would be required to actually meet our labor demands would be one important thing, because yeah, H1, HB1, HB2, those kinds of things. I think that's got to get addressed, because everyone who says like, well, no, I totally support immigration, but I want people to immigrate legally and get in line, they say that as though it's so easy to just get in line and come in, whereas naturalization now takes like 25 or 30 years or something like that. And that's because according to going all the way back to the 1965 Immigration and Nationalization Act, naturalization, a very limited number of visas can be given to Western Hemisphere immigrants, and it's always much smaller than either the demand of laborers or the number of people wanting to immigrate. So that feeds the numbers, the seeming spike in undocumented immigrants. So I think that's one thing, a realistic assessment of the visa picture. I think that foreign relations and how, like, aid to countries in Latin America or how we intervene in the affairs of other countries and whether we intervene, that's got to be another big picture, kind of understanding our role more in the hemisphere. I think that employers have also been remarkably successful at remaining in the shadows of public debate. They're present lobbying on Capitol Hill. They're there. They're involved in immigration debates, arguing for more temporary guest workers. They want their crops to be picked. They want their shirts to be sewn, etc. So they're there in the governmental debates, but you rarely see them in front of a television camera taking stands publicly because they're business people and they don't want to take a side because they want their goods to appeal to everyone, right? So somehow casting, I think, more of a light on business practices would be good as well. I don't know if these translate to concrete policy proposals, but I think they're issues that should be a greater part of the public debate than a regularization of citizenship status or amnesty, a path to citizenship, and increased enforcement. Those are very narrow ways of understanding it, I think.
Thank you again for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you.